Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome 2017 CHIME Fall Forum Planning Committee Chair, Sarah Richardson.
Good morning. I see we have a few brave souls out there from last night's show, and wow, what a concert last night. Did you have a good time? Oh, yeah, it was really fun. It's a hard show to follow, but we have a final day here at CHIME17 that we think will rock you in a different way. I'm sure you noticed that the Fall Forum Planning Committee shook things up a little bit this year. We've replaced the encore sessions with leadership from the edge and brought in speakers who will collectively prepare you for the future that's both exciting and a little bit daunting. I would like to thank the Planning Committee this year for their vision and support as we look for ways to push the boundaries of this year's Fall Forum. We designed Leadership from the Edge as a program by CHIME members and for CHIME members on topics that are important and relevant to us. The three presenters today are passionate about using IT to change healthcare for the better. They're pushing themselves to go outside of their comfort zones, and they will push you to do the same. There will be a lot to take in. That is one reason we've decided to live stream and archive these sessions so you can watch them in the future at your leisure and share them with your colleagues. Before we start, a few words about the format, because we shook that up too. We've designed these to be short TED Talk-like sessions, followed by a brief question and answer period. We've packed all three into this session. You'll have just enough time to catch your breath between them, so please don't get up for a break. So let's get right to it. Our first presenter is Donna Roach, CIO of Gulf Coast Health Ministry Ascension Information Services. Donna will talk about a program they initiated when she was CIO at Ascension's Via Christi Health in Wichita, Kansas. This is a fascinating look at how the routine use of health IT can be a barrier to care in certain situations, and how her team, by adapting systems to meet the needs of human trafficking victims, have helped people who are in desperate straits break the cycle of abuse. Please welcome Donna Roach.
It is my pleasure and actually privilege to talk to you about a topic that I have titled Human Trafficking, the Dark Side of Networking. But first I want to tell you a story. It's a story that begins with hardship but ends with hope. And it's a story that dates actually back to 1400 BC. Now, the time had come for the Israelites to claim their inheritance from God, the Promised Land. And they were preparing to cross the last remaining barrier between them and Canaan, the Jordan River. And they were fast approaching the walled fortress of Jericho. There was a woman who lived inside the walls of Jericho by the name of Rahab. And her fate had been set in motion years ago when she was a child. Summoned by the king, her father told her, "You must go. As long as you live in the palace and you please the king, I will prosper. If you refuse the king, he will have you and your family killed. Think of the honor he bestows on you. He chooses only the most beautiful women." Her father sold her into a life of prostitution for his own gain. So one night, Rahab was looking out of her window and she saw two men and noticed they weren't the typical soldiers that would usually guard the wall. They were clearly spies, and most likely they were from the Israelites' camp that were outside of the wall. But she noticed there was something very different about these men, and she knew she had to hide them in her home and guard them until they were safe and that they could safely escape. The two men eventually did leave, but they returned and they kept her and her family safe during the Battle of Jericho when the walls came tumbling down. Now, this is a Bible story most people know about, but the real story I want to highlight is Rahab's story. She was sold into a life of prostitution by all people, her father. And you might say, well, this is only a story, right? but this occurs today. Young men and women enter into the trap of prostitution or human trafficking, sometimes through a family member or lack of community support. And in 2016, a Trafficking in Persons report said that 50% of the cases show that a family member is usually the actual trafficker. So human trafficking is the illegal movement of people, typically for the purposes of forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation. It's the fastest growing criminal industry at $150 billion a year, what I'm calling the dark side of networking. And as you can see from Rahab's story, this has been going on for 1,000 years. Now, in 2000, the first federal human trafficking law, and it's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, was enacted, and it's been reauthorized several years. In 2015, the Department of Homeland Security began a blue campaign, and you can see one of their logos, campaign logos, up on the screen. And their focus was to combat human trafficking, bringing together the resources and capabilities across DHS to protect the victims, but also to bring the traffickers to justice. Now, according to a report from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, from 2015 to 2016, domestic human trafficking reports have increased by 35%. And yes, this is everywhere, whether you live in Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, New York, or even here in Texas. So Sarah already introduced me, but let me tell you a little bit more about my organization. Earlier this year, I was the Chief Information Officer at Via Christi in Wichita, Kansas. Now, Via Christi is 12 hospitals. We have approximately 250 ambulatory care sites. We employ approximately 8,000 associates, and we have 1,100 physicians actively on our medical staff. We are also part of Ascension Health, which is the largest Catholic healthcare organization in over 23 states in the District of Columbia. And you can kind of see our footprint up on the screen. Now, in 2015, it was recognized by a group of Via Christi clinicians that human trafficking was increasing, just like the statistics I told you. But they also noted that it was actually taking place in Wichita, Kansas. They saw patients coming through the facility, which really just made them wonder what was going on. But they had very little resources to depend on, and they basically could only treat and release these individuals. It was a group of nurses, a radiology tech, and a physician that began to study this a little bit more. They learned that between 50 and 88% of human trafficking victims come in contact with a healthcare professional, but only 2% are trained to ID the victim. So they weren't alone in how powerless they felt. They also learned that there's only 3 hospitals in the United States that had developed special procedures to identify human trafficking victims. At Via Christi, our informatics team partnered with our Via Christi clinicians, and we created a human trafficking assessment tool. And you can see a copy of it up on the screen. I have one in my hand. This helps identify cases of human trafficking when it presents in our healthcare system. Normally, it's in the ambulatory care site or in our emergency room. Clinicians have been trained to identify the signs and respond in the correct way. Community coordinators are brought in and to intercede, and we also enlist the help of our local police. The main focus is to protect the individual's identity and provide a safe environment. Even the brochure is coded to say HT rather than human trafficking, and that was another mechanism that we put in place. The overall goal of the assessment is to identify the red flags or indicators and how best to assess the situation at hand. In developing our program, we based it on 3 pillars: education, identification and response, and community and collaboration. The 3 types of indicators that we set up were 1, physical indicators. So was there a trauma, branding tattoos, or malnutrition? A second type of indicator were red flags that we looked for. So that might mean somebody is unable to give their address or may not even know what city or state they were currently in. And the third indicator we looked for were what we called control indicators. And this usually was indicative of a controlling person that maybe wouldn't allow the patient or victim to speak, or the individual themselves would avoid eye contact. If any of these indicators are present, the staff are trained to follow a 4-step process. First, they attend to the medical needs of the individual, but they also assess whether the individual is a minor, because if they are a minor, then we follow a child abuse protocol. Second, they bring in or they notify a specially trained human trafficking trained nurse to interview the patient and solicit the responses that may indicate that this person is a victim. Third, we provide the victim with the opportunity to notify our local law enforcement. And this is where it becomes extremely important that we've already developed those relationships with our local police. And fourth, if the patient doesn't want to notify the police at this time or any kind of community support, we provide them with the numbers to call in the future. And that's where this brochure becomes important, because those numbers are listed in the brochure. I use this picture not to just display a human trafficking victim, but also how important it was for us in IT not to jump right into this process, provide our 2 cents, but mainly to listen. We learned how vital it was for us to partner with our clinical teams to develop an effective program. And as a CIO, was to take a step back and be an agent for change rather than trying to automate everything. So I want to leave you with 6 pointers that we learned in IT that were important in creating this process. First, we had to closely listen to what was the workflow. Like I said, it wasn't always about documenting everything electronically. Sometimes we had to create a registration light, or sometimes no registration at all, to focus on protecting and guarding that individual's identity. Second, we had to add physical indicators to our documentation workflow. Like I mentioned before, a lot of times somebody may come in with branding tattoos, or a tattoo that may say property of, or they may come in with lingering physical trauma or lack of eye contact. These were things a lot of times that were overlooked in our documentation process, or sometimes just ignored. The third point was, when there's an inconsistency in patient and family history that was given, we had to detect this real time. And this was important because sometimes it required us immediately to try to pull the person or separate the person from a controlling individual or the individual that brought them into the facility. The fourth thing that we learned was training had to happen for more than just the clinicians on what were the protocols or red flags. This could include registrars, volunteers, pastoral care, even the security guard. Anyone could be utilized to recognize these indicators or red flags. Fifth, and important, you heard about this before, we needed to partner with community groups for system development. Most victims follow up with a community worker, and much of the documentation doesn't end up in our EHR. It's placed in a community record. And finally, and this may seem like a small point, but listening to the needs of our forensic nursing. Sometimes their needs are so small. For example, a forensic camera, it gets lost in the larger capital request or even operating requests. So I grew up outside of Chicago, when we had a radio announcer who would come on and he would tell this elaborate story. And then before commercial break and after commercial break, he'd come back and he'd say, so let me tell you the rest of the story. So I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. Since 2015, Ascension has educated over 500 associates and physicians on what are the signs and symptoms of human trafficking. This program is now in over 1,900 sites of service. This year, Via Christi has been able to intercede in 65 cases to date. Let me repeat that. 65 individuals now have hope. Wait, not done, thanks. Thank you. So I hope you see how relevant Rahab's story is today. And I want to challenge you all as CIOs to be part of a social change that can have true meaning in your community. Please go back to your hospitals, your ambulatory care sites, even if you're an imaging center, and find out what process is in place to detect human trafficking victims. Have we in IT made it easy or hard? Take that first step. I hope as CIOs and IT executives, you know that you can make a difference. So I want to leave you with a quote from one of my most favorite doctors. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. We have a couple of questions from the audience. I want to make sure you get a chance to answer. Your program has been integrated into other Ascension Health systems. Does it need to be customized for each new site?
It does to a degree. So remember I mentioned the protocols in the assessment tool are pretty standard. The key to this, and I'll tell you where we have seen the success, is when we have partnered effectively with our communities and our local police. I was talking to somebody earlier, and they clearly can identify with this, because think about this, a lot of times somebody may be brought into the emergency room by the local police, and they may not detect what's going on. Our assessment allows that, and rather than going through a kind of being thrown into whether it's juvenile detention or into a police lockup, they really now have a chance at doing something different with their life. And that kind of partnership that you have is vitally important, because you can't just do it on your own. You've got to have that kind of support.
Yeah. Are there other patient populations that you think would benefit from this approach?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I was thinking about this a little bit because we've been hit by so many hurricanes. And I think that people down, you know, in a bad situation get preyed upon. And I think it's another opportunity for us to provide an assessment of sometimes, you know, when we're in a situation where somebody is really needing help and they don't know how best to communicate it, you know, take, you know, the situations where we've had individuals trying to survive out of the hurricanes and maybe a little disoriented, and maybe somebody's taking advantage of them. That may be another opportunity. And so I just, you know, think about that. I hadn't really thought about that until you know, our emphasis here around the support for the hurricane victims. So yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. Well, Donna, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and your presentation is very meaningful to our audience today. So for our audience, please sit tight while we line up our next presenter. It will be only a short break before we begin again. Thank you. Donna reminded us that the focus of our work is the patient and not the technology. But how can we give patients quality care whenever and wherever they are if technology doesn't allow us to exchange data in a safe, accurate, and timely way? Our next presenter is willing to take on that challenge. Mike Marks will outline 7 core principles for achieving national interoperability and then make a proposal for how we can turn this into a reality. Mike also comes to us from Ascension in his new role as Market Information Officer. Please welcome Mike Marks.
Good morning, CHIME. Glad to see you here this morning. I'd like to talk to you about what I see as the future of interoperability and how we might get there. So interoperability is probably simultaneously one of the most promising things that we can do as healthcare IT professionals, but also one of the most vexing challenges that we have to figure out. We have a lot of vendors who will come in claiming that they have solved interoperability, that they can interface with anything. I think I hear laughter out there. And our hospital administrators and our physicians hearing that don't understand why we have such difficulty implementing interoperability, making it work, why it's so expensive, why it takes so long to do. And our government, who has paid us millions of dollars to implement this technology, is frustrated that we can't get it going, and they wonder if the reason is really data blocking. Well, I want to tell you a story that I hope will come true about our future of interoperability. And it's a story where we know that the patient that we have in front of us and the information that we have in front of us match. It's a story where that information flows seamlessly, as we all wish it would, from its source to the person who needs it, and it presents itself in an easy to understand, usable format. It's a world where we spend as much time trying to figure out how to make interoperability work as we spend trying to figure out how to get our email systems to talk to each other. It just happens. So let me take you a little bit through this. One of our key problems is that we have different definitions of what interoperability means. You usually hear about it used in 2 or 3 different contexts. One is what we are all used to, which is exchanging data provider to provider between us. But a second context that we've heard more recently is for patients to access their information, and more frequently to add to the information or control it. And the third context that we're now really hearing interoperability used is actually integration of apps into our systems. And the conversations about interoperability get so confusing because people are talking about each of these 3 different scenarios without realizing they're not talking about the same thing. So this is my definition of what interoperability means at a very basic level. It's getting relevant information about the patient to the person or the system that needs it and presenting it in a useful context. So if interoperability is something that we want, if it's a bridge to move information from one spot to another, this is the vision of what we want. It's something that's sleek. It's beautiful. It's something that makes our physicians smile in admiration as they receive those DCDs. I know we all have that experience, right? Yeah, me too. So if this is what we want for interoperability, well, this is what we have. And there's a lot of reasons for this. We have a lack of common understanding about what we even want and need in interoperability, so our vendors don't all deliver the same thing. We have too many competing partial solutions. We have data standards that are too weak. They're almost like the bridge deck here with rotten boards, that there's too many gaps things can fall through. We have networks that don't interconnect with each other. So we have a limited ability to really make interoperability work with all the holes that we have in our framework, in our capability. So how do we get there? Well, I kind of break what we need for interoperability into 3 major groups of principles of what interoperability needs to do for us. And that's really about how we define the data, how we move it, and how we use it. So let me walk you through these very quickly. First, of these, and one of the most key is open standards, especially data standards. Our current data standards are much too loose, much too flexible, frankly, and they make it so that we have a lot of work to do every time we exchange information, a lot of mapping and construction to exchange with a specific trading partner. So we need new standards that are much more highly regulated, frankly, that have mandatory core data that we can use all the time and trust that it'll be there. And if we have that, our interfaces, when we buy them, ought to be able to work with any trading partner without any additional effort and cost put into them. But in addition to that core information, the standards need to allow for extensions so that we can continue to innovate, add new information, and include what we need. But those extensions need to not break the usability of the core data in these interfaces. The last point on this is semantics. A lot of the communication that we do in our standards is based on codes that are not apples to apples information for us. One key example I hear of all the time is with some link codes, the same link code and the same result may mean two different things depending on what equipment that lab test was run on and what reagent was used. We cannot afford to continue to do that as an industry. And for those code sets that still have room for improvement, we've got to make those changes. And they're often not easy, I know that, but it's something we have to figure out how to do. The next principle is context. We talked about standardized data, but we all know that what data is needed varies depending on the use case, depending on the scenario that it's needed for. And some examples of use cases, just so you know what I mean, is the information that we need for acute and ED care is different than what we would need for transition of care, which is different than what we need for referrals to physicians or to specialists. It's different for chronic care management. It's different for patient access and engagement, or care coordination, payer coordination, payer approval, population health, public health, research. All of these have different data needs. We need to start with the few core use cases that we all have, standardize them across the industry, and make sure that we are exchanging the data reliably for those use cases so that we can start actually using the data that we send in a much more easy way. The next thing is universality. And there's a couple of pieces of this. For EHRs, it means, as I referred to, that the interoperability tools that we buy, the interfaces that we buy, need to be able to work with any trading partner regardless of what brand of system that they're on, and without further implementation costs, kind of like Direct Trust does for us now. For networks, we need them all to interconnect. It's that simple. We need them to do it seamlessly, and we need to not have to worry about or even know how they do it. We just need to know that when we send or receive information with our network of choice, that it can go anywhere in the country we need it to go, and trust that that will happen. And the networks need to have a relatively easy entry into that family of networks that exchange data together. Next principle is trust. We need to know, first of all, that we've got the right patient and the right information for that patient. I had talked to one state, HIE, that has 8 million of their citizens in their state in their records. And they were very proud of their 95% matching rate that they have using the various algorithms and statistics to identify patients. Well, if you do the math, that means that they are misidentifying 400,000 patients a year. We can't tolerate that. I wouldn't want to be one of those patients. We shouldn't accept it. We need a better solution, and we need to keep pushing within our industry and with our government to come up with something that gives us certainty that we have the right patient and the right matching. Non-repudiation simply means that we can trust the data as we receive it hasn't been changed along the way. Encryption gives that capability for us now. Hopefully blockchain will give us even better capabilities for that. But non-repudiation also means that we understand the age of the data and whether it's relevant or not. It's not helpful to clinicians if they receive a lab result, for example, that looks like it's from last week, but it's actually 5 years ago. We need to know what information is useful to them and present them only that. We need to be able to validate that the senders and receivers are who we think they are. And when someone is asking for data from us, it's not actually a a Russian or North Korean hacker pretending they're the hospital across town. And authorization. We need a standard, national standard authorization model that lets us ensure that, that the person asking for information has the right reporting relationship or the right relationship with that patient, and that the patient has not blocked their access, and that we resolve these opt-out, opt-in differences that we have in many states and even in some towns across different networks. The fifth is seamless communication, and I think you're already getting the sense of this, but our EHRs need to let us communicate just by knowing the address, whether it's a direct address or some other equivalent. We shouldn't need to go through a lot of setup for each organization that we're exchanging data with. And for HIEs, we need that seamless interconnection, not just for exchanging data, but also for the things where networks add value for us, things like record location. We should be able to ping our network of choice. It should be able to spider out to all the other networks across the country and bring back a consolidated response of all those records for that patient, no matter where in the country it comes from. Affordability. By now you should get the sense, if we can build all of these capabilities in a very standard way where they almost become plug and play for us, it should be very economical, very affordable for us to implement interoperability with just about anyone that we want to exchange with. And we shouldn't have to get into these battles anymore about whether someone is on the same network that we are and how much effort it's going to take to implement a new interface for them. The last, and this is probably the most important, is usability. It doesn't do us any good to exchange data, even flowing seamlessly, if that information, when it gets to the clinician who needs it, is unusable. We need to stop using, we need to stop using portals and make sure that we get all that data into the system that the clinician is using. We all have heard from clinicians they don't want to jump from system to system to system to get the whole view of the patient. And we need to present them only the data that they need. It doesn't do any good to send them a whole haystack of information in the CCD when they only want the 1 or 2 needles out of that haystack. We need to be able to pull those out, and we need to be able to present that external data right in with our internal data so that the whole comprehensive view of the patient. So those principles are my view of what interoperability in the future should be. I may not be right on all of them. I'm probably not right on some of them. But I think that would get us to the point that we could meet the demands of our clinicians, the demands of our patients, and the government in achieving the true national interoperability that we need. So the question is, how do we get there? There's an awful lot of work to be done to do this. I've been told more than once that trying to achieve this is like boiling the ocean. And to an extent, that's true. But if you think about it, we've been boiling the ocean for a while. We are spending a lot of money trying to make interoperability work, and with mixed success at best. We need to put together an industry collaboration that is truly across the industry, that includes the major associations such as CHIME and HIMSS and the standards bodies like HL7 and all those others. We need the government involved with ONC and the Department of Defense and probably Veterans Affairs, possibly others. And we need the expertise of associations like the informatics groups who really know a lot of the details of these things. We absolutely need the networks involved, both the geographic HIEs and also the vendor-based HIEs. We need to pull all these groups together to really do 3 key things. One is to validate what is the true definition of interoperability we're all going to strive for. I have a proposed version here, but we need to identify what the real one is. Second, these groups need to start chopping up this work into pieces that they can take on and solve for us. We have some wonderful leadership in our industry now working on things like getting the HIEs to interconnect and the vendor networks to interconnect and talk with each other, for example. And we have other groups in the industry that are working on use cases and defining the data needs for the different use cases. But none of these are organized. None of them are collected together to assemble into a common framework that we all can rely on. So we need an industry-wide collaboration to put together that framework and plug in all these solutions so that we can get to the end goal. The third thing that we need to do is adopt it. And if this works, you would think adoption wouldn't be hard, but we also know how difficult it is to get some obvious things to happen. The federal government has proven through meaningful use, whether we like it or not, that it is very strong for adoption. It's a great solution to make that happen. So I think we need to have the federal government be involved in creating this framework, but we also need to have the federal government commit to adopting it and making it a part of their certification standards so that we all take full use of it when it does come about. So how do we make this happen? Well, the key thing that we've been missing in our industry is leadership. We have most of the technology, and we have a lot of groups doing a lot of different things, but we have not had the leadership to pull all this together. And it's not something, as I said, that one group can do. I don't believe it's something the government can do. I don't believe that they have the political capital over the number of years required to actually pull this together. But I do believe this is an opportunity where we, as CIOs, could launch an initiative to pull everybody together. There was a call to action to make this happen by ONC and CMS several years ago when they issued their interoperability framework. There was another call to action just a couple of weeks ago by HIMSS to pull us all together and make this happen. I believe we need to do this, and we as CIOs, as the purchasers of much of this information, can do that. I think we can pull together the partners and get this going. The last thing that we as CIOs need to do, though, is partner and drive the collaboration within our own organizations. We need to educate our own executives and our department directors on what it is we're trying to do so that they work with us to stop buying technology that doesn't do this and help us work together on integrating the full system so that we can deliver to them what they need. So that's my pitch. I ask that you help us as we pull together this effort over the next couple of years, if we can do it. I ask you to get engaged, get your clinicians engaged, get your teams engaged. Help us make this story come true. Thank you for the honor of your time.
Well, thank you, Mike. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and thank you for the call to action today as well. A couple questions from our audience.
Sure.
In a collaboration with so many players, how can you ensure that everyone stays on track over time?
That's probably one of the hardest problems to solve and probably why it hasn't happened till now. I'm not sure what the right answer is. I think we need to pull together leaders in our industry, not just in CHIME, who have dealt with this kind of challenge before. And if we get the major players such as HIMSS, CHIME, HL7, ONC, getting the federal firepower in there as well, I think we can get most people to come along. As long as we all have a clear vision of what we're trying to achieve, and that clear definition is what we've been lacking so far, I think we may be able to do it. We absolutely fail if we don't even try. I, for one, am not willing to accept failure right at the start.
Yep. Once we achieve interoperability, whose role will it be to make sure it continues to work both effectively and efficiently?
Possibly that same collaboration. I may be retired by the time it comes about. But I think we'll probably find that we're going to mature into kind of a governing body across the industry to make this happen, and it may be the same groups. It may evolve into some other form that I can't predict. That's for the leaders who engage in this to figure out. I would love to be able to bring the solutions, but I'm not naive enough to think that I have those answers. I do believe that within this room and within the rest of this industry, we do have the knowledge to make that happen.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So Mike asked us, we asked Mike for a bold vision, he delivered it, and we're going to be talking about interoperability for many CHIMEs to come. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the next slide. We've got one more group that is going to be joining us this morning. They're going to tell us about what's next for our careers, so please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Thank you. We have one last presentation to go. If you want to know where your career is headed, these are the two to hear it from. We know that healthcare IT, whatever we are doing today, will change tomorrow. That one given, as our two presenters presentation have shown, that we have a larger role in healthcare moving forward. Our next two presenters are clinician CIOs who see the CIO as a partner with clinicians and patients in their healthcare journeys. In the spirit of partnership, Teresa Meadows, Senior Vice President and CIO at Cook Children's Hospital, and George Reynolds, retired CIO, CMIO, and Clinical Informatics Executive Advisor to CHIME, are going to do a joint presentation. Let's please welcome Teresa and George to the stage.
Good morning. Thanks for coming. The stage is smoking. That is so cool.
Yeah. Had to make the mood right.
Yeah. So the genesis for this talk was actually a conversation I had with a pretty well-known CIO a few months ago. And he said, George, they're taking all the fun stuff away. They're taking things that I like to do and they're giving them to other people. You know, they stood up a innovation office and they hired a chief innovation officer and they're off over there and they've got pop health and they got a whole department with their own analytics over here and these are things that I care about and if they keep taking the stuff I care about away, I'm just not going to have any fun. And you guys have seen this. This is happening all over the country. You know, there are chief health information officers. Sometimes they're related to the CIO, many times they're not. You've got chief innovation officers. You've got the chief digital officer. You've got the VP for Pop Health and the VP for Business Intelligence, and they've got, you know, maybe their own analytics departments. And then, of course, you've got CISOs. And the thing is, most of the, or at least a lot of the activities that these people engage in are things that the CIO used to be responsible for. The irony of it is, we've spent the last 10 years building, you know, going from a best-of-breed platform to an enterprise-wide integrated platform, and now all of a sudden, the same organizations that spent millions of dollars to do that seem to be determined to build brand new silos on top of that integrated platform.
So how many people feel like this? I wake up every morning and wonder what the next thing's going to be. We're moving from implementing EHRs to optimization. We're looking at moving from volume to value. And Dale Sanders has a great slide if you've never seen this before, but what this describes is how do we define healthcare value? It's the outcomes divided by how much it costs us to get there. The problem with that equation is that we don't know the analytics behind the outcome or how much it costs us. And so we spend a lot of time trying to determine how are we going to get to value if we can't even do the analytics to get there. We also spend a lot of time thinking about ACOs, clinically integrated networks, and building analytics structures that will support our next big thing in healthcare. And then what comes along? Cybersecurity. It's hacking away, no pun intended, at our jobs and you know, really making us wonder what is it we do next?
So what is it the CIO should be doing next?
You know, George, maybe before we get there, let's talk about why we're even qualified to be up here. I'm sure people are wondering.
You mean because we're both kind of crazy and decided to be fun to get up and commit professional suicide in front of a couple hundred of our closest friends?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. All right.
You know, George, you know, maybe tell us a little bit about how you ended up in this role.
Oh, well, I'm a doctor.
And is there any other qualifications you have that might have?
You need more?
Yeah, I realize doctors know everything, but to be a CIO, I think you need some other qualifications other than just being a physician.
Oh, well, okay. I guess the real story is the journey, isn't it? It's how we got to where we are and what it took to learn the tasks to do that.
Yeah.
As a physician, when I took over the role as the CIO, there were predictions of global disaster. I mean, I'm serious. It was fire and brimstone coming down from the sky, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. It was going to be horrific. My boss got phone calls from internal stakeholders and from CIOs in the area, at least one of which I know wanted the gig. They said, he can't be the CIO. He's not technical. He doesn't know anything about data centers. He doesn't know anything about cybersecurity. He doesn't know anything about networks. And doctors can't lead teams. Doctors are cowboys. Doctors are terrible at team leading, and half the IT department's going to quit in the first 6 months. And perhaps worst of all, if you're the CFO, and my boss was the CFO, the only thing doctors know about budgets is how to break them. Teresa, what did they say about you as a nurse, being a CIO?
Yeah, I'm going to put a disclaimer on this because I'm sure it might be offensive to people, but these are things that actually were said. She's a woman. She doesn't know what a cow is. She thinks cows are things that are in the pasture. They're not. She doesn't know about networks. She is very good at wiping butts and pushing meds. Why would we make her the CIO?
Now, hold on a second. You are a nationally recognized expert in cybersecurity. You co-chair the Department of Health and Human Services Task Force on Cybersecurity. You speak at AHIS lots. How is it possible that you became an expert in cybersecurity? First of all, you don't have a technical background. Second of all, you never served in the military and IT. And as you point out, you don't have a Y chromosome. How can you possibly know anything about security?
You know, and I think that's the challenge. You have to challenge yourself to learn new things. And so when I started as the CIO and started in healthcare IT, I didn't know anything. And so my goal was to learn. And I think that's really the challenge that I put before you, is to learn new things. Learn new things about yourself, the others that you work with, and learn how to integrate those things into your career. So I have spent a lot of time over the last 20 plus years trying to learn things other than just the clinical aspects. That's very important. I know a lot about workflow. I know a lot about how nurses and doctors think, and sometimes that's very scary. But I also had to learn about the technical aspects and really understand what it takes to take those technical abilities and integrate those into a clinical workflow. I had to learn about regulations. I had to learn about cybersecurity. And when you can relate those things to patient care, it's very easy to then begin to learn how to move those things forward. And so I would recommend that everyone takes the time to do that, because the CIO job today doesn't look the same as it did 10 years ago, and it's not going to look the same as it in 10 more years. It's going to be constantly evolving and moving through the process. You know, George, I'd like to know a little bit about you, because, I know a lot about you. You've implemented a large EHR implementation very successfully. You consolidated data centers. You implemented new security procedures in your organization. You've won numerous awards around innovation, IT adoption, your IT staff happiness, many best places to work awards. So all those things they said about you being a doctor, they weren't correct, were they?
Oh yeah, mostly they were totally correct. Totally correct. Maybe not the team building one, because as an intensivist, we live a team-based world, so I wasn't hopeless at that, but I was kind of hopeless at a lot of it. One example, I mentioned I worked for the CFO, and he said, "Congratulations, you're the new CIO. I want you to go cut the budget by 5%. Huh, okay. So I went back to my team, we sat down with the spreadsheets, I said, we're not going to reduce any FTEs, we're going to find 5%, and we did it. And I came back with a spreadsheet, and I was so proud, like I was turning in my homework, and I said, here you go, boss. And he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he said, where's the other half? I said, the other half of what? He said, the other half of the money. I said, that's 5%. He said, George, we work on a calendar fiscal year. It's the end of June. You've spent half the money. I said, well, so you wanted me to cut 10%? He said, duh. I said, why didn't you say that? He said, I did. And so my education began, and it continues to this day, but that's the point. So now can we talk about what CIOs can do in this changing environment?
Absolutely, let's move it forward.
Okay, so being a sensitive physician and nurse, our first rule is keep calm and suck it up. This stuff isn't going to get any easier.
And the reality of it is, and you all know this, we've been to this CHIME conference for many, many years, and every year we hear it's getting harder. We can't keep up with the pace. It's not sustainable. The reality of it is, that's all true. We can't keep up with the pace. It's accelerating. And, you know, we could spend a lot of time worrying about how we move forward. We heard from Kelly McGonigal about, you know, stress can be our ally. Stress is good. We need to take advantage of that. You know, worrying about what's going to happen does not solve the problem. Worry is not your strategy.
No, and the strategy is pretty straightforward. Focus. Focus on the strategic initiatives that the organization cares about, like, you know, focus like a laser beam, and then figure out what you need to delegate. This isn't about keeping all of the cheese. It's about keeping the good cheese, the strategically important cheese, which often is the fun cheese. So don't become a cheese hoarder, become a cheese connoisseur, and delegate things that you don't need to pay attention to so that you can continue to add value to the organization.
And the reality is, if you don't delegate, it'll get delegated for you. And the things that you want to keep will get delegated to someone else. So it's in everybody's best interest to select the things that they want to be in charge of and you want to own, and then delegate and offload everything else, because that'll get you in the right place of owning the strategic priorities versus being told what your priorities will be.
Yeah, and I think that's some of what we're seeing in the marketplace is organizations delegating for you. You know, another really important topic we haven't touched on yet is burnout. Dr. Varghese talked about physician burnout, and physician burnout is both a medical, John Nosgay at Mayo argues that it's a healthcare crisis. Over 50% of physicians are burned out. A burned out physician is twice as likely to leave your organization in the next 18 to 24 months. The replacement costs for that physician are anywhere between $250,000 and $1 million, depending on where that physician is. And it's not just physicians. It's nurses, it's other clinicians. We need to find ways to help.
You know, the next thing, our second, tip would be learn new stuff. Be in constant learning mode. If you look at the things that are in front of us, there are a lot of opportunities to learn new things. So for example, population health. How many people came into healthcare IT as an expert at population health? Very little. I didn't think I saw anybody's hands. That's something we all need to learn. That's something that we can help drive and change, but we have to learn it. We have to figure out what we need to do. Take a class, learn from your colleagues who are doing a lot of good work in population health. The other thing to help with burnout, not only with physicians and clinicians, and it's burnout for our own selves.
Right.
When you learn new things, it alleviates some of the burnout. It re-energizes you. It moves you forward into other avenues. And really partnering and knowing where to build the partnerships with people. So for example, in my organization, I have a CTO, I have a CMIO, I have a chief security officer, and we're a team. And what I see my job is not losing the good stuff. My job is the glue. I glue all the parts together, and I'm the one that can build the consistent strategy and message. All of those folks are wonderful in their own areas, but I'm the person that's going to put all the pieces together, and that's what I would encourage you to do. Learn enough about their roles so when they're telling you the strategy they'd like to deploy, you understand how it fits with the other roles and how it fits with your role. And then you are the one that educates the organization on how that all fits together, and that's how you become the expert. You don't have to know everything, but learn new things.
Yeah, Dr. Varghese talked about reconnecting with the meaning and keeping the good stuff, keeping the stuff that you care about, that we're passionate about, and not having that cheese taken away is part of how you remain connected with why you went into this field. And our third piece of advice is partner with clinicians. Duh, you got a nurse and a doctor up here. What do you think we're going to tell you? If you're not attached at the hip to your CNIO and your CMIO, you're going to have a really tough time navigating these changes going ahead, because I know it's really trite to say we're in the healthcare business, not the IT business, but we really are in the healthcare business, and that means we need healthcare expertise, and those are your partners to go to.
And if you don't have those roles, cultivate them. Find physicians, nurses, other clinicians who want to be part of the process. Cultivate those partnerships. Spend time with them, round with them, have them spend time with you, because it's as important for the clinicians to learn what it is to be a technologist and how those two things fit together and how we're in the business of healthcare together and we're not two separate silos.
Right. You know, CT Lynn and Steve Hess are the CMIO and the CIO at University of Colorado. And every year for the last 3 years, they've presented a track session at this conference. And they do it because their message is the power of that partnership makes them much greater than 1 + 1. And how many of you brought your CMIO or your CNIO to this conference this year? I got a couple. Well, I see one who happens to be both the CMIO and the CIO, so that's kind of cheating. But you got to ask yourself, if you're not doing that, why aren't you doing it? You find this valuable. Wouldn't it be valuable to them? Anyway, here's the thing. 10 years ago, the COO was probably the person everyone recognized as knowing the most about the organization and how it really worked. That hasn't been true for years. It's you guys. It's the CIO who really understands how the organization works. You understand how RevCycle relates to the clinical workflow of the physicians and HR and what's going on in facilities and biomed, God help us, and all these things. You people are the people who understand at a very deep level how the organization really works. Knowledge is power. That makes you one of the most valuable people in the organization. They shouldn't be taking your cheese away from you. You're adding value. It doesn't always feel like you've got that power, but you really do.
Yeah, and keep in mind that, you know, clinicians, nurses, doctors, they're going through a rapid pace of change too.
That's right.
And our goal is to hopefully instill the importance of the partnership and build it being that glue that brings people together. If we can be the glue, then we can change the world of healthcare.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was insightful for everybody in the audience. And we have a couple questions to ask you both. If you could write a job description that encapsulates your ideal role for a CIO, what duties would it be? What would you keep? What would you drop? What would you add?
Yeah, you know, for me, I would absolutely keep analytics. I would keep population health. I personally would keep security. I believe that's a patient safety issue, and keeping that close. What would I drop? You know, I'd drop more of the operational role. I think, you know, we spend a lot of time in operations, in the day-to-day activities. At least in my organization, we don't have a very big team, and so I spend a lot of time there. And if I could take that out of my job every day, I'd absolutely do that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say something controversial. I think the idea of a CISO reporting to the CEO or the board is nuts. I think the CISO should be reporting to the CIO, and the CIO is ultimately responsible for security. I personally think it's reasonable to have a CMIO who has the clinical applications that you can delegate. You can delegate the managing of the clinical applications. Keep innovation, keep analytics, and obviously the real job is strategy. It's a strategic job.
That's a good perspective, thank you. One more question for you. What can younger CIOs and IT executives do now to position themselves to be leaders in the future? What skills and experience should they be pursuing?
You know, I'll tell a really brief story. So when I was a younger person, one of the CIOs that I worked for said, "So what do you want to be when you grow up?" And I'm really bad about things like this. I just said, "I want your job." And so, you know, I think it's asking for what you want, and working with somebody who's more senior to you to put together the plan, and looking for those skills where you have gaps. So in my case, as a nurse, initially when I came into IT, I tried to fill my resume with things that were more technically oriented. Worked in consulting, worked for a software development company, worked for, you know, a software provider. And I think you have to look for those things that round you out, because if I had totally focused on the clinical aspects, I know that I wouldn't have gotten where I am today. So that would be my recommendation for younger people who are trying to move into the role.
Yeah, well, first of all, obviously, take the CIO boot camp. After you take the CIO boot camp, build relationships. It's about relationships. It's about learning how other people live. So if you are clinical, get out and learn technical. If you are technical, spend times with the doctors and the nurses, shadow people, learn how what their workflow looks like, learn what their concerns are, build relationships.
Thank you.
There you go.
So a big thanks to our speakers and to our Fall Forum Planning Committee for making our first Leadership from the Edge a huge success. Remember, this has been live streamed and will be archived so you can watch it again at your leisure. And tell your colleagues who missed the forum this year to check it out online. The forum will continue at 9:15 with our closing keynote from Dawn Tapscott. Dawn is a true innovator with a knack for spotting technology revolutions long before they take hold. If you want a glimpse of the future in healthcare and see how you fit in, don't go away. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.